morning, but an unhurried morning. Dave and Morley are in their kitchen, both of them doing their own stuff, both of them getting ready for the day ahead. When Dave says, I'm going to visit Marty this afternoon in the hospital, Morley, who has her back to him, turns with her eyebrows arched. Really, she says? Come on, said Dave, that's not fair. Wasn't it? Fair? Dave's relationship with hospitals over the years has not been, well, without problems. Why, the very first time Dave and Morley were in a hospital together, Dave had fainted, flat cold. It was a week or so before Stephanie was born. They'd gone with their birthing class, the big tour. And halfway through it, the tour, when they were led into the actual birthing room and Dave came face to face with the moment of truth, with the birthing table, his knees had buckled and he had staggered against the green concrete wall. 3 of the other fathers picked him up and carried him across the room and laid him out on the table. It was Ron, the class clown, who had put Dave's feet into the stirrups. Come on, said Dave. That was over 20 years ago. Because what, said Morley? Things have changed since then? It isn't that Dave is a full-blown hypochondriac. Morley'd never say that. He isn't. But there's no denying he has hypochondriacal tendencies. And those tendencies, mixed with his personality, those tendencies tend to get him into trouble. There was, for instance, the time he inhaled the fly. And he became convinced that the fly was alive in his lungs, was colonizing his lungs. We know this because Dave's friend Kenny Wong caught him in the record store late one night after closing hours. Dave had a lamp over on the counter by the cash. He had taken the shade off the lamp. He had the lamp on and he was hovering over the lit bulb, his mouth wide open. Kenny looked at him and said, "It's moths that are attracted to light." Dave said, "You're right. What are flies attracted to?" There was a time in the drugstore when Dave got himself trapped in the cuff of the blood pressure chair. All his friends gathered around him, friends and neighbors watching the machine and his blood pressure inch up. They waited until his nose started bleeding before they called the fire department. Had to cut him out with the jaws of life. What, are you telling me I can't go?" said Dave. "Of course not," said Morley. "Of course not. You should go. I'm just telling you, just don't do anything stupid, Dave. Just don't embarrass me. Or Marty. Dave's pal, Marty, from the early days. Of all the guys from back then, no one would have pegged Marty to be the guy who'd have a stroke. 2 weeks ago, standing in his living room. He's walking again, said Dave, and they're talking about moving him to rehab. But he has to use one of those walkers. And Lillian says he's depressed. She says he doesn't seem to care. It's like he's given up. I have to go see him. I'm not saying you can't, said Morley. I'm just saying I don't want any phone calls from the hospital. Marty had a bed on the 7th floor. When Dave got there, he was lying in his bed looking pale and deflated, like someone had let the air out of him. His eyes were shut. His mouth was open. He was drooling a little. "Marty," said Dave, "you look great." "You look terrible," said Marty. "You think they don't have mirrors here?" They sat together for half an hour, not saying much, sitting quietly the way old friends can sit when the only things to say are important things. There was a box of tissue on the side table, and every 10 minutes or so, Dave grabbed a tissue and wiped Marty's chin. He threw the tissue in a garbage pail in the bathroom. Every time he was in there, he pulled out a little bottle of hand sanitizer and rubbed some in his hands. "I can smell that stuff," said Marty. "What, do you think strokes are contagious?" Dave had been there maybe an hour when he suggested they go outside. "Well, we should go for a walk," he said. Marty rolled his eyes. "We could take a wheelchair. I could push you." Marty said, "I'm not going out like this." Dave said, "Come on, it's beautiful out. It'll make you feel better." Marty said, "I'd feel like an idiot." Dave looked at his friend, at his sunken gray face, at the blue hospital robe. Who would want to be seen looking like that? He was going to argue, but he didn't argue right, said Dave. He said it twice, right. Then he said, "I'll be right back. I won't be long." He almost sprinted out of the room. When he got back, Marty was asleep again, lying on his back, his mouth open, snoring quietly. Dave reached out and put his hand on his shoulder. "Hey," he said softly, "hey." Marty opened his eyes without moving. It took him a moment to register what he was looking at. And when it did register, he shook his head back and forth. "No way," he said. Dave was standing beside the bed, beaming. He was wearing a light blue hospital gown and nothing else. Dave said, "One for all for one." There was a wheelchair beside him. He leaned over and he grabbed Marty under the arms to help him out of the bed and into the chair. Unfortunately, he hadn't put the brakes on the wheelchair. It was not the smoothest transition. At one point, Dave ended up sitting in the wheelchair with Marty sitting in his lap. The chair rolling across the room. It looked like some sort of new geriatric go-karty sort of event. But they finally did it. "We did it," said Dave, panting. As Dave pushed him down the corridor, Marty said, "Where'd you get it?" Dave said, "Well, they have him in the lounge." Marty said, "I mean the robe." Well, that's what had taken him so long. He looked everywhere. Finally, he had followed a porter onto an elevator. The porter was pushing a steel cart full of linen. As the porter gazed at the floor numbers chunking by, Dave reached out, grabbed the gown from the cart, and stuffed it under his jacket. He changed in a washroom on Marty's floor at the far end of the hall. "Where are your clothes?" said Marty. He'd rolled his clothes up and had hidden them on a shelf of supplies in the hallway. What, you don't think that's a good idea? Shelf on a cart with swabs and masks and gowns and sterile pads and Dave's clothes stuffed at the back. They took the elevator down to the main floor. The gowns they were both wearing were the ones that tied in the back. Dave's ended just above his knees. He looked ridiculous, which of course was exactly the way he wanted to look. They went out the back door into a little garden, and they sat in the sun. After a while, Marty said, "You're right. It is nice out here. It makes me feel lighter." Dave said, "How about going to Rebecca's for a coffee?" Marty looked horrified. Marty said, "Are you crazy? I can't leave the hospital grounds. Some guy tried that last week, some old guy. You should have seen what happened." What had happened was they had called a code yellow, missing patient. Marty twisted around in the wheelchair trying to make eye contact. They shut down all the elevators. There were guards on all the doors. Times have changed, Dave. You can't fool around the way we used to. Dave wasn't listening. Dave was already pushing Marty toward the sidewalk. Dave believed the outing would do Marty good. Marty just closed his eyes and slid down in the wheelchair. "Oh no, here we go," said Marty. They were heading to a little cafe in Anderson Mill, a place Marty went to all the time. They got their coffees, 2 flat whites. They took them across the street to a little park by a school. It was nearly 4 in the afternoon when Dave wheeled Marty back to his room. Dave wasn't about to admit it, but he felt a sense of relief when they got there to be back. He had spotted a security guard watching them in front of the hospital, and he'd felt a rush of panic. He thought the guard was going to bust them, and dear God, he was determined not to, mess this up. Marty hadn't noticed. Marty said, "That was good, the coffee." "You were right. I enjoyed it," he said. Dave said, "We'll do it again." "Thanks," said Marty. I've been feeling..." He didn't want to finish the sentence. But Dave didn't say anything, so he had to. "I've been feeling sad." Neither of them moved for a moment after that. Then Dave leaned over and gave Marty a hug. "I'll see you," he said. And then he turned to leave, and as he turned, he reached around to his backside, thinking to himself that when he was leaned over hugging Marty, there must have been a full moon rise. And so he left and he wandered down the corridor to the cart where he had hidden his clothes. And when he got there, the cart was gone. This is the part of the story where I catch up with you. We're all on the same page now. Dave looked where the cart was supposed to be. He said, "Oh, come on." There was a handicapped bathroom down the hall. He went in and locked the door behind him. He just needed a moment alone. He needed a moment to figure this out. Stood there in the darkness for a minute staring at the locked door, and then he flicked on the lights, and when he did, he just about jumped out of his skin. There was someone in there with him. "Excuse me," he said, jumping. "I'm so sorry." And the stranger jumped at exactly the same moment he did, exactly, and said exactly the same thing, which is when Dave realized he was staring at his own blue-robed self in the mirror. He was just about to open the washroom door when he heard the announcement, "Code yellow, code yellow, code yellow." The woman on the public address system repeated herself 3 times. Standard procedure. Dave stood there with his hand on the door, listening intently. Were they talking about him and Marty? Had the security guard filed a report? The PA system interrupted his questions. "Code yellow," said the woman one more time. Then she said, "White, middle-aged patient, brown hair." Well, could be anyone. Which meant, of course, could be Dave. Locked in the 7th floor bathroom, Dave frowned. Something told him this was not good news. What did he know? Well, he knew this. He knew he had to get out of the hospital without a scene. And to do that, he knew he had to get out without anyone seeing him. He opened the bathroom door and he looked around the hallway. There was a stairwell at the far end of the hall. Figured there'd be a fire door at the bottom. He figured, right. And he made it all the way to the second floor when he heard the burst of radio static coming up the stairwell toward him. And so he stopped and he peered over the railing, and he saw the security guard from outside. Now, how could he possibly explain himself? Sneaking down the stairwell in a hospital gown during a code yellow. All he knew was he didn't want Morley getting a phone call from hospital security. And so he slipped through the exit door and out onto the second floor. And then, without stopping to think, into the first room he came upon. The patient's room, and gloriously empty. He went into the room, and then he went into the bathroom, and he shut the door behind him. His heart was pounding. He waited in there for, well, what seemed like an eternity. And then he came out, and when he did, the security guard was standing in the hallway waiting for him. And their eyes locked. And Dave smiled. And in a moment of divine inspiration, he did not break the guard's gaze. He just smiled, and then he turned and he crossed the empty room and crawled into the empty hospital bed. The guard came in and stared at him. And Dave just closed his eyes and pretended he was going to sleep. And he heard the guard leave. And while he lay there trying to settle his heart, he pondered his next move. And while he did that, a nurse breezed in carrying a dinner tray. "Hello," she said, "my name's Dana. It's supper time." And she placed a tray on the tall table by the side of the bed, and she pushed it in front of him, and then she stood there. Only thing Dave could do was eat the meal. "It's good," said Dave as he spooned the cold mashed potatoes into his mouth. "Eat your dessert," said the nurse. She was pointing at a bowl of applesauce. "Thanks," said Dave, "I'm okay." "I mixed your medication into it," she said. "It'll help you sleep." And she picked up his spoon. And Dave watched in horror as she dipped it into the drugged applesauce. And she held the spoon up to his mouth. "Open up," she said. What else could he do? She made sure he finished every last bit. He woke up 4 hours later. And when he woke, he was on a gurney. And there was a man in blue scrubs wheeling him down a corridor. "Hey," said the man in the scrubs, "you ready?" "What?" said Dave, and he tried to sit up. But he couldn't sit up because he was strapped to the gurney. "What are these straps for?" said Dave. And the man in the scrubs said, "Well, people often lash around during the procedure." "There's been a mistake," said Dave. "I don't need a procedure." And the orderly said, "That's what they all say." Then he maneuvered the cart around a corner and into a room that looked exactly like the birthing room. Except it wasn't the birthing room. Dave caught a sign on the door as it swung shut behind him. Proctology. By the book. The orderly should not have left Dave alone in there. But he did. It was only 2 minutes, and he was, after all, strapped down. When he returned, Dave was still strapped to the gurney, but he was no longer lying on top of it. He'd flipped it over. The gurney was on top of him. Dave was trying to squirm his way to the door with the gurney tied on his back. No hands. He looked like a seal on a piece of ice. The next time he came to, he was in the emergency ward. A young intern was stitching up a gash in his forehead. Marty was sitting in the corner. Marty was beaming. Marty had heard the code yellow and put 2 and 2 together. It was Marty who had identified him. "Hey," said Marty when Dave opened his eyes. "You look good." "I look terrible," said Dave. And then he looked at the intern. "He told you I'm not the missing guy, right?" "Oh, yeah," said Marty. "That was some guy who was supposed to be having a proctology procedure." Dave sat up and looked at the clock on the wall. It was after 8. Dave said, "I'm so out of here." The intern was shaking his head. "Head injury," said Marty. "You're in for 24 hours observation. They put you in my room." An hour later, they were lying in their respective beds. Dave tugging at his ID bracelet like it was a pair of handcuffs. Marty was having the time of his life. Marty was holding up his cell phone, waving it back and forth. "You gotta phone her sometime," said Marty. Dave said, "You call her for me. Tell her there was an accident. Tell her I'm in a coma." Marty said, "I'm a stroke victim. That's too sophisticated for me." And he flipped the cell phone across the room, and Dave caught it. And Marty sank back on his pillows, and he reached out and he turned off the lights. And the two of them lay there in the darkness for maybe 5 minutes. And then Marty snorted and giggled and smiled. And across the dark room, he said, "Good night, John boy." He hadn't had this much fun for years.